I remember the house most clearly at dusk, that hour when everything felt like it was holding its breath. The walls seemed to hum with silence, the air heavy with that old varnish smell from the wooden floor. My father's shoes were always neatly placed by the door, his coat hanging on the same hook, his voice echoing through the hall like a slow reminder that order lived here, not love. He wasn't a cruel man, not in the way people imagine cruelty. He never shouted without reason, never struck without a lesson attached. But there was something colder about him, the kind of control that wrapped itself around you slowly until you stopped remembering where your own will ended and his began. When I was little, maybe 7 or 8, I thought obedience was love. I thought being good meant being safe. My father used to say, a child's heart should be still enough to hear his conscience speak. I didn't understand it then, but I learned to stay quiet enough to listen. To him, to the ticking of the clock, to my own breath when I tried not to cry. Our house was a place of rules, the kind that didn't need to be written down because you could feel them in the air. Shoes off at the door, hands folded during dinner, speak only when spoken to. No television after 9, no arguments, no questions. Mother followed those rules too, though not always willingly. I used to watch her move around the kitchen with that tired softness, her face half lit by the yellow lamp above the stove. She spoke little, always careful with her words as if they might break the calm. She'd smile at me sometimes, those small, secret smiles that felt like apologies she could never say out loud. I remember one night in particular, the night that started it all, though I didn't know it then. It was winter, maybe 89. The snow outside was thick against the window panes, blurring the world into white silence. I'd forgotten to close the back gate after feeding our dog, Charlie. My father came home late that night, and the first thing he noticed was that Charlie wasn't in his kennel. "Where's the dog?" he asked, his tone calm. Too calm. My hands froze. I could feel the heat rush to my face before the words even formed. He he ran out, I think. I forgot to close. "You forgot," he repeated, setting his briefcase down, his voice soft like the beginning of a storm. Mother was standing by the sink, drying the same plate over and over, pretending not to exist. I wanted her to speak, to say something, anything, but silence was safer for her too. He walked to the window, his reflection framed by the falling snow. He said finally, "Go find him." I stared. It was freezing outside. I was wearing pajamas and socks. "Now." That word landed like a stone in my chest. I remember stepping out barefoot into the snow, the air biting at my skin, the world so still it felt unreal. I searched the backyard, calling Charlie's name until my throat hurt. My breath came out in little clouds, my fingers numb. By the time I found the dog near the fence, shivering but alive, I couldn't feel my legs anymore. When I came back in, my father was still standing in the same place, arms crossed. His eyes didn't soften when he saw me. "Did you learn something?" he asked. I nodded, trying not to let my teeth chatter. He smiled faintly, as if satisfied. "Then it was worth it." I didn't cry that night. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why the lesson hurt more than the cold. I thought about how he'd looked at me, not with anger, but with that measured certainty that he was doing the right thing. That was what made it so confusing. He always believed in what he did. That's what fear does. It convinces you it's love in disguise. In the years that followed, I learned to anticipate everything. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the subtle shift in his tone, the quiet between his words that meant disappointment. You learn to read silence like language when you grew up like that. By the time I turned 12, I had perfected the art of being invisible. I spoke only when I knew the answers. I smiled when required. I said yes, father, like it was a reflex, like breathing. But there was one evening, the beginning of the real break, when something small, almost meaningless, started to unravel the order he had built. It was a Sunday. We were having dinner, roast beef, peas,
the smell of iron and butter filling the room. The television in the living room was turned off, as always. My father was reading the paper. I sat straight, waiting for him to speak before touching my plate. He asked me about school. I answered carefully. He asked about my grades. I said they were fine. He folded the newspaper slowly, looked at me for a long time, and said, "You're starting to sound like your mother." I didn't know what he meant. Maybe it was the way I hesitated before answering, or the quiet tone in my voice. But the way he said it, like it was a flaw, made something twist inside me. Mother looked up sharply, then lowered her eyes again. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean—" "Stop apologizing," he interrupted. "You don't mean anything if you're always sorry." His words hit harder than any slap. I remember my throat tightening, a warmth behind my eyes I couldn't let escape. I nodded, instead, obedient as ever. But in that moment, something tiny shifted. For the first time, I felt the quiet wasn't peace. It was control. That realization didn't happen like lightning. It came slow, like the way frost spreads across a window pane. Quietly, beautifully, until it blinds the glass. That night when I went to bed, I heard the sound of his footsteps down the hall, steady and precise. He paused outside my door, as he always did, listening to make sure I was still. I closed my eyes, breathing evenly, pretending to sleep. When the floor creaked under his step, I realized it wasn't obedience that kept me still anymore. It was fear. And once fear replaces love, the lesson is never truly forgotten.
By the time I turned 13, the lessons had become quieter, but sharper. My father no longer needed to raise his voice. His silence did the work for him. It filled the house like smoke, seeping under doors, curling around every thought. He had a way of teaching that felt almost scientific. Every mistake became an experiment, every reaction carefully observed. If I flinched, he adjusted. If I disobeyed, he recalibrated. His punishments weren't born of anger. They were methodical, measured, like tightening the strings of an instrument until the note rang pure. Mother called it discipline. I began to think of it as conditioning. One afternoon, I came home from school late. The buses had been delayed, and by the time I reached our front steps, the streetlights were flickering on. My stomach dropped when I saw the living room light glowing through the window. He was home. The door creaked as I entered. His shoes were already by the mat, polished to a mirror sheen. His coat hung perfectly straight. "You're late." His voice floated from the kitchen, calm, controlled. Bus was excuses." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The sound of his chair scraping against the tile was louder than any yell. He stepped into view, sleeves rolled up, the faint smell of aftershave mixing with the scent of stew simmering on the stove. "What do we say when we fail to meet expectations?" he asked. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He sighed through his nose. "You apologize too easily. A man accepts consequence, not pity." I knew what was coming before he moved. His punishments were almost ritual. The slow walk to the study, the sound of the door closing, the quiet lecture before anything else. The waiting was worse than the act itself. That night, he didn't use the belt. He made me stand facing the wall for an hour, hands clasped behind my back, reciting, "Order builds strength. Strength builds character. Character earns respect. My legs shook, my throat dry from the repetition, but he stood behind me the entire time, silent, watching. I could feel his presence like a shadow pressed against my skin. When it was over, he said, "You'll thank me one day." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that maybe somewhere in all this structure, there was love trying to make me strong. But as I crawled into bed later, the words twisted in my mind. Order builds strength. It didn't feel like strength. It felt like disappearance. The next few months blurred together. Days marked by perfect manners, perfect posture, perfect lies. I learned to laugh when he did, to mirror his expressions at the dinner table. It was survival through imitation. Mother drifted further into silence, moving like a ghost through each room. Then came the night of the science fair. I had worked for weeks on my project, an electrical circuit board carefully soldered and labeled. It wasn't brilliant, but it was mine. The fair ended late, and I walked home with the small ribbon folded in my pocket. Second place. I thought maybe he'd be proud. He was waiting in the living room when I came in, reading again. The house smelled of polish and coffee. "How did it go?" he asked without looking up. "I got second place." I smiled, nervous but hopeful. He lowered the paper slowly, eyes locking on mine. "Second." "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "Who got first?" "A boy named Mark. His father helped him build a motor." He cut me off with a wave. "So he didn't do it alone?" "No, sir." "And yet he won." I didn't answer. He leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. "Do you know why that happens, son? Because effort without discipline is wasted motion. You probably rushed somewhere, skipped a step." I tried my best. His voice hardened. "Trying isn't enough. Results are." The ribbon in my pocket suddenly felt heavy. He stood, adjusted his cuff, and said quietly, "Go to the study." My stomach turned cold. Inside, the air felt smaller. The desk lamp cast everything in that same amber glow. The belt hung neatly on its hook behind the door. He didn't reach for it immediately, just looked at me for a long, suffocating moment. "You think I enjoy this? You think I like being the villain?" I shook my head quickly, tears stinging my eyes. "Then learn. Don't make me remind you again." That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the faint cracks on the ceiling, tracing them like roads that led somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. The next morning, my arm ached and the ribbon was gone from my jacket pocket. I found it later in the trash can, beside his desk, crumpled and wet with coffee. I didn't take it out. I just looked at it and felt something shift again. Deeper this time. It wasn't anger. Not yet. Just a strange, hollow understanding that no matter how hard I tried, perfection would always belong to him. Days turned into weeks, and the house settled back into its routine. But I started noticing the cracks in him, too. The way his hand trembled slightly when he poured his drink. The way he stared at the window long after the sun went down. Sometimes late at night, I'd hear him pacing in the study, soft footsteps, muttering under his breath, repeating the same words he made me say, "Order builds strength, strength builds character." It was like he was trying to convince himself, not me. And in that fragile realization, I found the smallest flicker of defiance. Not rebellion, just awareness. The kind that lives quietly under your ribs and waits for the right moment to breathe.
By the time I turned 15, I had learned how to disappear in plain sight. I could smile when expected, answer when spoken to, and move through the house like a shadow that cast no sound. My father called it maturity. I called it silence wearing discipline's mask. School became my only place of air. Even there I was quiet, too careful, too trained. But sometimes, during art class, I'd lose myself in drawing. Lines became a kind of release. I drew hands, mostly. Hands gripping, reaching, sometimes breaking. I didn't show them to anyone. It was late autumn when everything began to shift. The house felt colder that year, not from weather, but from the kind of emptiness that clings to walls after too many years of control. My mother had started spending nights at her sister's, claiming migraines. I think she just couldn't stand the sound of the silence anymore. One night, my father found one of my sketches left on the table. It was of a man standing over a boy, the shadow of the man forming the shape of a belt. The boy's face was turned away. When I came home that evening, the drawing lay neatly folded on the kitchen counter. He was sitting in the chair, waiting. "Sit down," he said. I obeyed. He slid the paper toward me. "Explain this." My throat tightened. "It's just an assignment for art class." His eyes narrowed. "You expect me to believe this came from school?" I nodded weakly. He unfolded it again, staring. "You think I don't see what this is?" His voice was low, trembling with something new, not anger exactly, but the fear of losing control. "You've been poisoned by weakness, by people who don't understand what strength means." I wanted to say, "It's just a drawing," but something inside me refused to speak. My silence seemed to enrage him more than words ever could. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping the tile. "You're becoming soft, disrespectful, like your mother." The insult hit me harder than the slap that followed. The sound cracked through the room, sharp and hollow. My head whipped to the side, cheek burning. But this time, I didn't cry. Something inside me froze, then hardened. He waited, expecting tears, apology, surrender. But I just stared at him. My eyes met his, not with defiance, but with a calm so complete it scared him. That night, for the first time, I didn't go to the study when he told me to. I locked myself in my room instead. He knocked once, then twice, then silence. When I finally heard his footsteps fade, I sat by the window. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, one dim streetlight flickering against the rain. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked out there, how impossible peace felt inside. The next morning, the world pretended nothing had happened. Breakfast, school, routine. But something irreversible had cracked. A few days later, during dinner, he spoke without looking up from his plate. "Discipline only works when both sides accept the lesson. If one side stops learning," he let the sentence hang. Mother glanced at me, then back at her plate. No one said a word. That night, he came to my room again, holding the sketch. "I destroyed it. That part of you is gone now." But he was wrong. Destroying it only gave it power. A week passed, then another. He stopped talking to me entirely. The house filled with tension so thick I could almost taste it. The quiet became unbearable. And then came the final night. The one burned into my memory so deep it still echoes when I close my eyes. I came home from school to find the study door open. He was sitting there, the belt laid across the desk, not hanging, laid out like a symbol waiting for meaning. "Sit," he said softly. I hesitated. "For what?" "For understanding."
He gestured to the belt. "Do you know what this represents?" I didn't answer. "It's not pain," he said. "It's order. The world is chaos, son. You'll understand one day. You'll thank me." My voice came out barely above a whisper. "I don't think I will." He froze. "What did you say?" "I said I won't thank you. Not for this. Not for being afraid to breathe in my own house." His face went pale, then red. "You don't understand what love is. If this is love, then I'd rather be unloved." The silence that followed felt like a lifetime compressed into a breath. He reached for the belt, but stopped halfway. His hand trembled. "You've changed," he said quietly. "You think you're stronger now? You think you're free?" I didn't reply. I just stood there, heart pounding, waiting for him to move, and when he didn't, I turned and walked out. For a moment, I expected the sound of footsteps behind me, the crack of leather, his voice calling me back, but it never came. That was the last night he ever tried to teach me a lesson. A few weeks later, I left for boarding school. Mother arranged it quietly, her eyes red but relieved. He didn't come to see me off. On the train ride there, I kept seeing his silhouette through the reflection in the window, a tall figure framed by that amber study light, alone with his rules. I realized something then. He wasn't just controlling me, he was trying to control the fear inside himself. The belt, the words, the rituals, all of it was his armor against the chaos of his own past. Maybe someone had taught him the same way. Maybe fear had been his only language too. But understanding doesn't erase pain. It only explains its shape. And to this day, whenever I hear the sound of leather tightening, or the echo of footsteps in a quiet hallway, something inside me still flinches, not from fear of him, but from the ghost of who I was when I believed obedience could save love.
It's strange how silence follows you, like a scent, like dust that settles into the corners of your life. Even years later, I could still feel it. The same stillness that once filled our house now lived inside me. I was 32 when I finally went back. The city had changed. New buildings, new faces, the familiar streets now covered with the noise of a world that had moved on without me. But when I stood in front of that old 2-story house, it looked almost the same. The paint had faded, the garden overgrown, but the windows still stared back with the same hollow calmness, as if they'd been holding their breath for decades. My father had grown ill by then. Heart problems, the neighbors said. A body trained to endure had finally started to rebel. I hadn't seen him in almost 10 years. The air inside the house was heavy with nostalgia. Not the sweet kind, but the kind that clings like regret. I walked through the hallway, fingers brushing against the wall where my childhood height marks were once penciled in. They'd been painted over. The color looked duller than I remembered. I found him in the living room, sitting by the window, a blanket over his knees. His hair had turned white, thinner, but his eyes were still sharp, the same eyes that once watched everything. He looked up when I entered. "So you finally came," he said, voice raspy but steady. I nodded. "It's been a long time." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." The words still carried weight. My body obeyed before my mind could resist. For a long time we didn't speak. The only sound was the faint tick of a wall clock, the same one from my childhood, still counting out its quiet discipline. "I heard you teach now," he said finally. "Yes, psychology." He gave a dry laugh. "Of course, studying the mind to understand what went wrong with yours." I didn't rise to it. I'd learned long ago that anger gave him oxygen. Silence made him suffocate. He leaned forward slightly. "You think I was cruel." "I know you were." He blinked as if I'd slapped him. "I did what I thought was right. A man has to raise his son to survive."
And did it work? I asked softly. Did I survive the way you wanted me to? He stared at me for a long time. His hand trembled slightly, the veins thin beneath wrinkled skin. You turned out strong, he said at last. I smiled faintly. Strong isn't the same as whole. Something flickered in his eyes then. A crack, small but real. He turned his gaze to the window. You wouldn't understand, he said quietly. My father was worse. I swore I'd never be like him, but sometimes... He stopped, jaw tightening. Sometimes we inherit the ghosts we hate the most. The words hung between us like dust in sunlight. For the first time, I saw him not as the tyrant of my youth, but as a man carrying his own invisible wounds, a boy who never outgrew the lessons of fear. I used to think you enjoyed it, the control, the punishments, but maybe you were just afraid I'd become you. He didn't answer. His breathing had grown shallow, the rise and fall of his chest slow and uneven. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. He wanted to make me better, he whispered. I didn't know another way. The belt was still there, hanging behind the study door. I saw it when I went to fetch him water. Old, cracked leather, stiff with years of silence. I stared at it for a long time, remembering the sound it used to make cutting through the air. When I returned, he was asleep. His face looked strangely peaceful, almost childlike. For the first time, I felt no fear, only an aching sadness. I sat beside him until evening. The house grew darker as the sun slipped behind the trees, that same amber light spilling across the floor, the light that had once made the walls glow like fire. I thought of all the times I had stood in that same room, trembling, waiting for a lesson I never needed. And now, sitting beside the man who once defined my world, I realized something cruelly simple. Discipline can shape a body, but fear shapes a soul. When he woke again, I said quietly, I forgive you. He looked confused. For what?
For teaching me to mistake fear for love. He tried to speak, but no words came. Only a faint, broken exhale. His eyes glistened, and for the first time in my life, I saw him look small. Not in stature, but in spirit. I left that night before he fell asleep again. Outside, the cold wind carried the faint smell of burning leaves. The streetlight buzzed overhead, casting that familiar yellow glow, the same light I once stared at through my bedroom window, praying for morning. As I walked away, I realized the lesson he had given me was not obedience or control. It was the opposite. He had taught me, through every wound, every silence, the cost of never learning how to love without fear. Years later, when I had a son of my own, I hung no belts on walls. When he broke a rule, I sat beside him instead of standing over him. When he cried, I listened. Because I'd learned that children don't remember punishment. They remember tone, distance, the weight of footsteps coming down the hall. And sometimes, when I looked into my son's eyes, I saw a reflection of myself. Not the boy I used to be, but the man I became despite it all. Some nights when the house is quiet and everyone's asleep, I still hear echoes of that old clock, the rhythm of a time when love was measured by obedience. But then I look at my son, sleeping peacefully, unafraid, and I realize that maybe this is the only redemption left. not changing the past, but ending its repetition. The sound of fear finally stops with me.